She caught her husband cheating, but instead of confronting him, she did something far colder. She waited. She gathered proof. She prepared lawyers. And then she invited him to a gala where he proudly sat beside his mistress, not knowing he was walking straight into the most elegant public destruction of his life. Because that night, his wife stopped being silent.
Heels. The first thing people noticed about the woman in red was not her beauty. It was the way she walked into the ballroom as if she had already survived, something no one else in the room knew about. Heels. The crystal chandeliers above her scattered light over marble floors, champagne towers, silk dresses, polished shoes, and expensive smiles. But none of that touched her face. Lena Morrison kept her chin level, her shoulders relaxed, her steps measured. Heels. She was not here to impress anyone. She was here to end something. At the front of the room, on a raised platform meant for the most important guests, the Bennett family table glowed under a warmer pool of light. Heels. Richard Bennett sat there in a tuxedo that fit him perfectly, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who believed the world was arranged for his comfort. His mother, Patricia, Heels, sat near him with the still posture of a woman who judged everyone in a room within 3 seconds and usually judged them harshly. Heels. His father, James, wore the tired expression of a man who had spent decades making peace with things he should have challenged. And in the chair that should have belonged to Lena sat Candace Wright, blonde, elegant, amused. Heels. One hand resting near Richard's arm with a sort of familiarity that only looked innocent if you had never been lied to before. Lena stopped at the edge of the platform and felt the entire room shift, not loudly, quietly. Heels. The way a room changes when people sense that something uncomfortable is about to happen and are ashamed of how much they want to watch. Richard turned. Surprise flashed across his face first, then irritation. Heels. Then that practiced social smile that meant he wanted to look gracious while saying something cruel. "Lena," he said, too softly for the microphone but loud enough for the nearby tables. "What are you doing here?" It was a ridiculous question. Heels. She was his wife. Heels. She was wearing a formal invitation on her wrist and had approved half the names on the guest list herself through channels he never knew existed. But Richard asked it like she had wandered into the wrong wedding. Patricia lowered her glass. "Darling," Heels, she said, "the family table is rather full." Candace did not move. She did not even pretend to rise. She smiled in a way that was almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. Lena looked at the occupied chair, then at Richard. "That seat is mine." Heels. Richard laughed. It was a small laugh, a dangerous kind, the kind that told a woman she was about to be made into a lesson. "Don't do this tonight," he said. "Candace is here with us. Mother invited her. This is an important event. If you make a scene, Heels, you'll embarrass everyone." Lena asked. "Or you?" He stepped closer. His voice dropped. "Go sit in the back, please. For once, just do what I'm asking without turning it into drama." Around them, conversations died one by one. Heels. The string quartet kept playing, which somehow made the humiliation cleaner and sharper. Lena could feel eyes on her. Investors, executives, their wives, staff members carrying trays, security at the wall. Heels. People who did not know the truth and people who absolutely did. 5 years earlier, she had met Richard at a charity gala after her father's death. She had been 27, sleepless, grieving. Heels, and carrying the weight of a company people assumed would crush her. Thomas Morrison had built Morrison Holdings from one commercial property into a diversified empire. Real estate, logistics, medical research, clean energy, urban redevelopment. Heels. When he died suddenly at his desk, the headlines talked about numbers, net worth, market influence, leadership succession. Heels. None of them talked about the daughter who had to identify his body and then walk into a boardroom 3 days later because grief did not stop quarterly reporting. Lena had wanted one thing no money could buy. Heels. To be seen without being measured. Richard arrived in that season of her life like a pause in noise. He was funny, warm, observant in ways that felt intimate instead of invasive. He made her laugh when laughter still felt disloyal to mourning. Heels. He listened when she said she was tired of rooms full of people performing concern. He offered coffee instead of sympathy. He asked who she was instead of what she inherited. At least that was what she believed. Heels. So she left out her last name the night they met. Then the next night too. Then for weeks. By the time she realized how much she wanted him, the truth had become harder to tell. Not because she was ashamed of it. Heels. because she was afraid of what it would change. Richard thought she had a modest trust, some investments, enough to be comfortable. She let him think it. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would explain when the time was right. Heels. And love made cowards of both honesty and timing. They married quietly. Heels. He promised partnership. She promised trust while hiding the largest fact about her life. For a while, the lie sat still. In the first year of marriage, Richard was attentive. He brought flowers. He kissed her forehead in the kitchen. Heels. He talked about building a future together. During the day, while he believed she was shopping, volunteering, or having lunch with friends, Lena ran Morrison Holdings from private offices, secure calls, proxy structures, heels, and legal architecture designed by her father to protect her until she was ready to lead publicly. She made billion-dollar decisions while her husband argued over boutique venture deals and told dinner guests he was under enormous pressure. Heels. She never mocked him for it. She never needed him to be less so she could feel like more. But by the second year, his success began hardening him. Not all at once, slowly. The way contempt enters a marriage in silk slippers. First came corrections. Heels. Her dress was too bold. Heels. Her comments at dinner too pointed. Her phone use too distracting. Her schedule too vague. Then came suggestions disguised as guidance. She should get more involved in society circles. She should cultivate real accomplishments. Heels. She should make herself more presentable to people who mattered. Lena absorbed those comments longer than she should have, partly because she knew he did not know he was insulting a woman who signed off on projects larger than his entire portfolio, Heels, and partly because she kept hoping tenderness would return if she stayed patient. That hope is how many intelligent women lose years. Not because they are blind, because they are loyal to the memory of the person they first loved. By year 3, Heels, Richard no longer asked about her days. He talked at her, not with her. If she tried to raise a concern, she was emotional. If she questioned distance, she was needy. If she wanted honesty, she was exhausting. Patricia made it worse. Heels, she never screamed. Heels. Women like Patricia rarely need to. They know how to wound with table manners. She would smile over dinner and say things like, "I always imagined Richard would marry someone more substantial." Heels. Or it must be so restful to have no real responsibilities. James usually looked away. That was his failure, not cruelty, cowardice. And cowardice, when repeated over years, does almost as much damage as cruelty. Heels. Candace entered their orbit the way trouble often does in wealthy families. Socially approved, carefully framed, impossible to challenge without sounding insecure. She was a friend of a cousin, then a regular guest, Heels. Then the woman Patricia suddenly adored. Candace laughed a little too long at Richard's jokes. Richard stood a little too straight when Candace walked into a room. By then, Lena already knew the marriage was thinning. Heels. What she did not know yet was how little dignity Richard would leave intact on the way out. Heels. The truth arrived 6 months before the gala, lit up on his phone while it sat unlocked on a bathroom counter. One message, then another. "Last night was perfect. I can still smell your cologne. When are you finally going to tell her?" Heels. Lena did not throw the phone. She did not confront him dripping from the shower. She sat on the closed toilet lid and kept reading until the ache in her chest became something colder and cleaner. Richard complained that his wife was clingy, tired, Heels, hard to manage. He wrote that he needed to figure out the finances before he left, so Lena would be taken care of. That line changed everything, not because it was the cruelest, because it revealed the full architecture of his delusion. Heels. He thought he was the provider, the powerful one, the person with options. He thought his wife would one day be a dependent obligation he generously settled. Heels. He had been sleeping in a home bought through her structures, using accounts funded by her wealth, benefiting from a social world made possible by a name he never bothered to truly ask about. In that bathroom, Lena did not become vengeful. Heels. She became clear. There is a difference. Revenge wants pain returned. Clarity wants truth arranged in daylight. The next morning, she called Grace Torres, her executive assistant at Morrison Holdings, and said, "I need to leave my husband, Heels, and I need to do it without losing myself." Grace did not gasp. She did not pity her. She said, "Tell me what you need." That is one of the purest forms of love in any human relationship, not rescue, not drama, practical loyalty. Together, Heels, they built a plan. 6 months. Legal preparation, documentation, security coordination, asset separation, quiet relocation of personal belongings, a new penthouse under one of Morrison's divisions, divorce papers ready for service, and one final thing. Deals. Lena decided the annual Morrison Holdings Gala would be the night she stopped hiding, not to humiliate Richard for sport, to reclaim her own life in public, fully and on record. Tonight was that night. Deals. Richard raised his champagne flute and flicked his hand toward the back of the room. There are tables available, he said. You'll be more comfortable there. More comfortable. It was the language of class management. Deals. Put the problem farther away so the illusion remains elegant. Lena stared at him for one long second, memorizing the face of the man she had once trusted with the tenderest part of herself, and then she turned. Deals. She walked through the ballroom toward the back while whispers followed her like static. A waiter nearly called her by the wrong name. Morrison, not Bennett. He caught himself. She thanked him for water. Her phone buzzed inside her clutch. Grace. Deals. Security is briefed. Lawyers on standby, say the word. Lena typed back beneath the table. Proceed as planned. Deals. Then she looked up at the chandeliers she had selected, the marble she had approved, the staff she employed, the board members she had led from behind layers of privacy, Deals, and the husband who had just sent her to the shadows in a building whose existence fed his pride. The lights dimmed. The music stopped. Jeffrey Santos, Morrison's communications director, took the stage. Richard finally turned toward the podium. Deals. Good evening, everyone, Jeffrey began. Tonight we celebrate legacy. The legacy of Thomas Morrison, and the woman who has expanded that legacy beyond anything even he imagined. Confusion moved across the front table. Patricia frowned. Deals. Richard shifted forward. Jeffrey smiled. Please welcome the CEO and sole owner of Morrison Holdings, Lena Morrison. The spotlight found her at the back. Richard's glass slipped from his hand and shattered against marble. Deals. In the silence that followed, the entire room learned at once what Richard Bennett had failed to learn in 5 years of marriage. The woman he had just tried to hide was the most powerful person there. Deals. If there is one thing wealthy people understand better than most, it is timing. Not morals, not truth, timing. When to speak, when to stay quiet, when to release a statement, when to deny one, when to look wounded, when to look unbothered. Deals. Lena understood timing too, but her father had taught it to her differently. Never speak too early, Thomas Morrison used to say. People reveal themselves while they think you're powerless. In the months after his death, Deals, that lesson had saved her in boardrooms full of men who thought grief made her weak. It had saved her with bankers who smiled too much and explained terms she already understood. It had saved her with competitors who mistook privacy for fear. Deals. But the lesson almost ruined her in marriage, because patience in personal life can become self-erasure if you are not careful. Deals. The morning after she found Richard's messages, Lena sat in her private office on the 31st floor of Morrison Tower while the city moved below her, in hard lines of glass and traffic. Grace closed the door and placed a legal pad on the desk. No fuss. Deals. No theatrics. Do you want the marriage to survive? She asked. Lena thought about that. Really thought. Not about the memory of Richard. Not about the first year. Not about the man in the coffee shop who listened to her pain like it mattered. Deals. She thought about the man who rolled his eyes when she spoke. The man who called her emotional when she asked for intimacy. The man who let his mother reduce her to decorative waste. Deals. The man sleeping with another woman while privately planning how to take care of her. No, Lena said. I want to leave with my dignity. That answer shaped everything that followed. Harold Sterling, her attorney, was discreet and unemotional. Deals, which was exactly what she needed. Deals. He came in that afternoon with 2 associates, a forensic accountant, and a stack of questions so specific they made her feel, for the first time in months, protected. Had Richard ever had access to ownership documents? Deals. No. Did he know the real source of household funds? No. Were there shared ventures in which he could plausibly claim strategic contribution? No. Had she maintained dated records of executive decisions during the marriage? Yes. Deals. Had Richard supported her publicly or professionally in any verifiable way? Silence answered before she did. Harold wrote something down. That's useful, he said. It shouldn't be, Grace muttered. Harold looked up. In divorce, Deals, the truth matters less than what can be demonstrated. We demonstrate. That sentence became a framework for the next 6 months. The plan had several layers. The legal one was obvious. Separate her personal residence. Move irreplaceable documents. Deals. Preserve timelines. Secure communications. Deals. Prepare for reputational attack, because a humiliated husband from an old money family was not going to accept narrative defeat gracefully. The operational layer was more delicate. Lena would continue appearing socially as Richard's wife. Heels. She would not expose the affair. She would not provoke confrontation. She would gather data, not because she wanted to punish. Because clarity under pressure is easier when you are not improvising. The emotional layer was the hardest. Heels. She had to continue living beside a man who no longer deserved access to her softness while not allowing bitterness to deform her character. That required discipline more exhausting than any corporate negotiation. Heels. There were nights Richard came home smelling like a hotel bathroom and expensive whiskey, kissed the top of her head absent-mindedly, and asked if she had done anything interesting that day. Lena would look at him and say, work, thinking, reading. Heels, all true, just not in the language he imagined. Heels. She never shouted, not because she was afraid, because she refused to train herself into chaos just to match his. There is a form of strength that looks quiet from the outside, but costs a person everything to maintain. Heels. The world rarely praises that strength because it is not dramatic enough to entertain. But it is often the strength that keeps people from becoming cruel while they are being wounded. To keep herself from breaking into sharp pieces. Heels. Lena returned to habits she had abandoned in marriage. Therapy, consistently. Early morning walks without her phone. Reading the old letters her father had left sealed in his desk. One of them contained only 3 lines. Heels. Never reduce yourself to make another person feel tall. Love without self-respect becomes permission. And permission teaches the wrong people how to treat you. She read that note 3 times, then cried so hard she had to cancel 2 meetings. Heels. Healing is not neat. Heels. It does not look elegant in a silk robe by a floor-to-ceiling window. Sometimes it looks like a grown woman bent over her dead father's handwriting, because a truth lands only when you are finally tired enough to stop arguing with it. Meanwhile, Heels. Richard kept performing his own mythology. He talked about his deals as if the market rose because he breathed. He liked telling stories at dinners where he framed himself as the practical partner and Lena as the vague, indulged wife. Heels. She keeps life beautiful, he once said to a table of donors, smiling with false affection. I keep it functional, Patricia laughed. Lena smiled too, not because she accepted the insult. Heels. Because she already knew what that line would sound like in retrospect when the truth came out. That is another thing patience can do. It archives. Candace, for her part, behaved with the confidence of a woman who believes she is ascending. Heels. Lena studied her without hatred. Heels. Candace was not innocent, but she was also not the architect of Lena's pain. She was the beneficiary of Richard's weakness, the mirror in which Patricia could admire a more socially convenient fantasy. Heels. To hate her too deeply would be to misunderstand the structure. Men like Richard do not betray because a woman tempts them beyond reason. They betray because they believe their needs are more urgent than their promises. Candace was a symptom. Heels. Richard was the choice. Once that distinction settled, Lena found she could think more clearly. With grace, she shaped the gala not as a revenge theater, but as a truth event with unavoidable symbolic force. Heels. The annual Morrison Holdings Gala had always honored the company's future direction, while quietly protecting Lena's anonymity. This year would be different. The board had already approved her formal emergence. Investors had been prepped in careful, Heels, confidential stages. Heels. Media invitations were selective, business press, not gossip press, because credibility mattered. The speeches were rewritten. Slides were prepared showing growth under her leadership, community investments, Heels, the launch of a Thomas Morrison Foundation for first-generation entrepreneurs, and a major urban sustainability initiative that would fund affordable housing mixed with green infrastructure. Heels. Grace understood instinctively that if Lena's reveal looked like mere personal retaliation, it would cheapen both the company and her own liberation. So every choice had to do 2 things at once. Tell the truth about who Lena was, Heels, and attach that truth to something larger than private betrayal. That is what makes a story feel real. In real life, dignified people rarely destroy themselves just to win a social moment. They anchor personal action inside principle. Heels. Lena's principle was simple: no more hiding and no more allowing disrespect to define the room. Heels. The educational value in that choice mattered to her more than she admitted out loud. She had seen too many women with resources, intelligence, Heels, and influence still shrink inside intimate relationships, because emotional humiliation does not check net worth before it enters a home. She wanted, perhaps for the first time in years, not just to survive but to model something. Not perfection, heals. Not invulnerability, a healthier ending. A person can leave without becoming monstrous. A person can tell the truth publicly without becoming petty. A person can defend herself and still remain human. In the final week before the gala, heals. Grace supervised technical rehearsals, staff briefings, and the controlled leak of nothing at all. Security was told only what they needed. Jeffrey Santos practiced the introduction until he could deliver it with warmth, authority, heels, and no hint of spectacle. Harold prepared service for the divorce papers to be completed the morning after the gala, not the night of. Heels. Symbolism matters, he said, but proper process matters more. Lena laughed at that. You make paperwork sound romantic. Paperwork, Harold replied dryly, is what saves women from men who think charm is an asset class. The night before the event, heels. Lena stood alone in her new penthouse for the first time. Boxes had already been unpacked. Her books lined one wall. Her father's fountain pen lay on a desk by the window. The place was not warm yet, not lived in, heels, but it was hers in a way her marriage home had not been for a long time. She made tea, sat on the floor with her back against the couch, and allowed herself one dangerous question. What if he had just loved me better? Not more. Better, heels. What if he had asked harder questions, looked closer, noticed? What if she had told him the truth in the first year, or the first month, or that very first coffee shop conversation? Would the story have changed? Perhaps. Heels, but healing asks a cruel honesty from us. Heels. A relationship built on a secret this large might have fractured eventually, no matter how kind the beginning had been. And a man whose ego required a smaller wife was always going to suffer beside an actual equal. This was not all Richard's failure. Heels. Lena had participated in the architecture by withholding herself, and then hoping love would somehow mature around absence. That insight did not excuse him, it matured her. The next day, she chose the red dress deliberately, not for vengeance. Heels. Visibility. No beige, Grace had said when they shopped weeks earlier. No apology colors. Red it was. Not seduction red, statement red. The shade a person wears when she is done volunteering to disappear. Heels. As the chauffeur pulled toward Morrison Tower, Lena watched the city through the tinted glass and felt an unfamiliar calm. Not because she knew the night would be easy. Because there are moments in life when the decision is finally made, heels, and once the decision is made, fear changes texture. Heels. It becomes weather. Present, but no longer directive. By the time Richard sent her to the back of the ballroom, she was no longer a woman waiting to see whether the marriage could be saved. Heels. She was an executive moving through the last stage of a transition. Still, she felt the humiliation. That mattered. Strength is not numbness. When Candace remained in Lena's seat and Richard dismissed her like an inconvenience, heels, something in the room recoiled, not because people are naturally noble, but because blatant disrespect triggers a primitive recognition. The staff felt it especially. They knew who she was. They had served Morrison functions for years. Heels. Some had known her father. As Lena crossed the ballroom, one young waiter looked ready to physically move a chair if she gave him the smallest signal. She didn't. A few more minutes, she whispered. He nodded. That too mattered. Heels. Dignity protects not only the self but the people watching. Heels. Public cruelty teaches observers that power gets to humiliate. Public composure teaches that humiliation can be interrupted by truth. When the lights dimmed and Jeffrey took the stage, the room shifted from gossip to attention. Heels. The first lines about Thomas Morrison's legacy created confusion. Good. Confusion is the crack where reality enters. Richard's face changed incrementally. Annoyance, curiosity, unease, then something close to fear. Patricia leaned toward him. Heels. Candace checked the printed program again as if ink might save her. Then the spotlight found Lena. The walk to the stage was longer than it looked in rehearsal. She could hear her own heels, the rustle of fabric, heels, a distant intake of breath from the right side of the room. Jeffrey extended a hand as she climbed the steps. You've got this, he murmured. Lena reached the podium, gripped its edges lightly, heels, and looked out at hundreds of faces reorganizing themselves in real time around a new truth. Good evening, she said. Heels. Her voice surprised even her. Steady, not hard. My name is Lena Morrison. I am the daughter of Thomas Morrison, and for the past 5 years I have served as CEO and sole owner of Morrison Holdings. Gasps are usually exaggerated in books and films. Heels. In real life, revelation often sounds like many smaller sounds at once, a dropped fork. Two people whispering no at the same time. A chair scraping. Richard stood so abruptly his chair tipped. That's not possible, he said. Lena looked at him. It is. Heels. she replied. Then she turned back to the room because he was no longer the audience that mattered. Heels. For the next 10 minutes, Lena did something far more difficult than exposing a cheater. She introduced herself to the world as a whole person. That distinction is important. Anyone can stand at a podium and weaponize pain. Heels. What takes real control is holding pain in one hand and purpose in the other without dropping either. Behind her, the screen lowered and a timeline appeared. Thomas Morrison with blueprint tubes under his arm 40 years earlier. Heels. The first commercial property, expansion maps, major milestones, then younger photographs of Lena at board meetings, graduate school, project sites, ribbon cuttings, community forums. Not glossy family propaganda, verifiable history. Heels. When my father died, she said, I was 27 and very much not ready to lose him. I also wasn't ready to become the public face of a company this large. So I made a decision to lead privately while I learned what kind of leader I wanted to be. Heels. She thanked the board, the executive team, legal counsel, and long-serving staff. Not ceremonially, specifically. People respond to truth when it contains names, timelines, receipts. Heels. She presented the company's growth under her leadership with discipline, market expansion, new jobs, strategic acquisitions, medical research partnerships, Heels, and the launch of the Thomas Morrison Foundation to fund young entrepreneurs who lacked family capital and elite access. That choice was intentional. Heels. Her father had built wealth in an era when merit and opportunity were never as separate from privilege as successful men liked pretending. Lena wanted the next generation to hear something different. Talent is everywhere, she said. Heels. Access is not. Morrison Holdings intends to invest where traditional networks don't. That line earned the first genuine applause. Then she moved to the moral center of the evening without ever speaking like a victim. Heels. For 5 years, she said, I allowed my private life to exist separately from my professional identity. I wanted to be loved without the distortion that wealth can create. In doing so, I made mistakes. Heels. I withheld truth from people who should have known it. I convinced myself that hiding was the same as protecting something real. It isn't. Real relationships can survive complexity. They cannot survive sustained absence. The room got quieter. Heels. People leaned in, not because scandal was coming. That much they already sensed. But because self-accountability changes the texture of a room. It disarms. Everyone expected either a cold corporate reveal or a public emotional explosion. Heels. What they got instead was an adult woman telling the truth in complete sentences. I'm saying this because I know there are people in this room, and people who will hear about tonight later, who have made themselves smaller to be easier to love. Heels, she continued. Please don't do that. It does not create intimacy. Heels. It creates confusion. And confusion will always be used by the wrong person. Some stories become larger than themselves in a single line. That was one of them. Grace, watching from the control station, Heels, would later say she felt the room change physically at that moment, as if the reveal stopped being gossip and became instruction. Lena did not mention the affair directly. Not yet. She did not need to. Instead, she made the next line do the work. Heels. I also know what it is to be underestimated in public and overlooked in private. Tonight is the end of that for me, and I hope for anyone who needed to see a woman reclaim her own name before she felt perfectly ready. Heels. Then she announced a formal ethics review of all corporate partnerships, investment relationships, and family-adjacent holdings that did not meet Morrison's standards around governance, transparency, and conduct. Heels. It was a business statement with personal consequences, which made it all the more devastating. Heels. Patricia understood before Richard did. Lena saw the color leave her face in stages. Some of the Bennett family's prestige rested on proximity to Morrison-connected opportunities, not ownership, influence, recommendation chains, preferred access, Heels. The sort of soft power old families use when they have mistaken social continuity for permanent entitlement. Integrity is not branding, Lena said. It is behavior under pressure. Morrison Holdings will be aligning itself accordingly. Heels. By the time she closed with a toast to her father and to new beginnings built on honesty instead of performance, the applause was no longer cautious. It was strong, sustained, and not entirely about business. People were applauding competence, Heels. Yes, but also courage and perhaps their own relief at witnessing someone finally say the thing they themselves had been postponing in other areas of life. The reporters in the room moved fast, but even they understood the hierarchy of the moment. Heels. This was not tabloid material first. It was a major leadership emergence tied to corporate transition and a public lesson in boundaries. As Lena stepped off the stage, board members approached her with congratulations. Heels. Investors asked for meetings about the new foundation. A hospital research partner thanked her for long-term funding continuity. Several women she barely knew touched her forearm and said some version of the same sentence. I needed to see that, Heels. That is how value gets added to a story, not by stapling a moral onto the end, but by letting human truth echo beyond the plot. Richard, meanwhile, Heels, was trying to move through the crowd with the dazed fury of a man whose reflection had just been replaced without his consent. Security closed in subtly, not theatrically. Grace had anticipated this. Public order protects everyone's dignity, Heels, including the person unraveling, Heels. But Richard was her husband, at least for one more evening, and eventually he reached her near a side corridor that led toward a quieter lounge. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot, though he was not drunk. Humiliation alone can intoxicate, Heels. We need to talk, he said, grabbing her elbow harder than he realized. Lena looked at his hand first, then at his face. Take your hand off me. He did, not out of respect, out of shock. What was that? He demanded. What do you mean? What was that? Heels. This whole thing. You made me look insane. There it was. The center of him. Not I hurt you. Not why didn't you trust me. Not how did we get here. He looked around to make sure no one too important could hear the next part. Heels. You let me stand there and what? Lena asked calmly. Dismiss my wife publicly at her own event? Richard swallowed. For a moment he looked genuinely disoriented, like a person waking from anesthesia. Heels. Why would you hide this from me? Because I wanted to know if I could be loved without it. That's ridiculous. Is it? She asked. Or is it just inconvenient now? He ran a hand through his hair. No one does this, Lena. Heels. No one hides running a multi-billion-dollar company from their spouse. No one should, she agreed. That part was my failure. I've already said so publicly, but my secrecy doesn't excuse your cruelty. The word landed. Cruelty. Heels. Richard hated language that pinned behavior to character. He preferred situational vocabulary, stress, misunderstanding, complexity. You think one speech turns you into the victim? He said. You lied for years, and you cheated for months. Heels. The silence after that felt cleaner than the ballroom had. Richard blinked. What? I know about Candace. You don't know what you think you know. Richard, Lena said, almost gently. You wrote it down. That was what broke his posture. Not guilt. Heels. Exposure. Heels. Men like Richard often imagine that if they can speak quickly enough, with enough indignation, they can outrun reality. But reality had receipts. When did you 6 months ago? 6 months? He stared at her. You knew for 6 months? I was preparing. Heels. Preparing what? My exit. He laughed then, a short sound edged with panic. This is insane. No, Lena said. What was insane was listening to you talk about taking care of my finances when you had no idea who paid for the floors you walked on. Heels. I contributed to our life. Socially? She asked. By bringing me into a family that treated me like decorative waste? He recoiled as if she had slapped him, which told her something useful. That line reached him more than the affair accusation had. Heels. Because under all his narcissism lived a little boy still performing for a mother who graded women like investments. Patricia arrived before the conversation could deepen. Of course she did. Heels. Some mothers do not raise sons out of boyhood. They build external management systems around them. Lena, Patricia said crisply, though her voice trembled at the edges. I think we should move this to a private room. There's nothing private left, Heels. Lena replied. James approached behind her, slower, his expression grave. Candace hovered several feet away, looking beautiful and suddenly deeply young. You are making a terrible mistake, Patricia said. Tonight was not the place for this, Heels. Lena looked at her, not unkindly. Respectfully, Patricia, tonight became the place for this the moment your son told me to sit in the back while his mistress sat in my seat. Candace flushed. Richard turned. Don't call her that. Why? Lena asked. Heels. Because accuracy feels rude. James closed his eyes briefly. Patricia straightened. This is exactly what I feared. Pettiness? No, Lena said. Pettiness would have been a private social ambush. Heels. What happened tonight was a leadership announcement followed by natural consequences. That line would be quoted later, and not because it was polished, because it was true. Patricia shifted tactics immediately. Women like her always do. Heels. Marriage is not something you discard because of embarrassment. No, Lena said. It's something you lose because of contempt. Patricia's mouth tightened. You are overreacting to one difficult period, An affair is not a period. It's a decision. Heels. Public humiliation is not a misunderstanding. It's a value system. James spoke then, finally. She's right, Patricia turned on him. James? No, he said, tired in a way that sounded decades deep. She is right. He looked at Richard. Heels. You failed to notice your wife. That is on you. Not her wealth, not her privacy. You. Richard looked wounded by that in a way he had not looked wounded by losing Lena. Fathers can still do that when they have withheld judgment for too long. Heels. Lena reached into her clutch and took out an envelope. She had not intended to hand him the papers that night, but when the moment presented itself with such surgical clarity, she trusted instinct. These are preliminary divorce documents, she said. Heels. Formal service will happen tomorrow. From this point forward, all communication goes through counsel. Richard stared at the envelope as if it had emerged from thin air. You planned this? Yes, she said. Adults plan exits from broken contracts. Heels. Candace took one involuntary step back. Patricia's face hardened into something nearly feral. You think your money makes you untouchable? Lena held her gaze. No, I think the truth makes me hard to corner. She could have stopped there. Heels. She almost did, but years of swallowed diminishment have a way of clarifying final language. You told me once at dinner that real marriages are built on equal value. You were right. Heels. The difference is that you never bothered to ask what value I carried because you were too busy ranking me. That won't happen again. Patricia said nothing. There are defeats that strip a person not of status but of script. Heels. She no longer knew what role to perform. Richard looked at Lena like a man staring at a map after driving off a bridge. You're destroying my life, he said quietly, and for the first time all night, Lena felt almost no anger at all. Heels. Only sadness for how small his understanding remained. No, she answered. I'm leaving the version of my life where you were allowed to define me. Then she turned and walked back toward the ballroom, where staff, investors, researchers, Heels, nonprofit partners, and employees still needed their CEO. To remain composed for another hour, Grace met her halfway. Do you want him removed? No, Lena said. I want him witnessed. That line, too, held a lesson. Not every wound needs a secret room. Heels. Sometimes the healthiest thing is simply to stop protecting the person causing harm from the natural visibility of their own behavior. Heels. By the time the last major donors left, the ballroom had changed character. It no longer felt like a glittering set for somebody else's power. It felt like a workplace after a difficult but necessary truth had been spoken aloud. Heels. Staff moved with more ease. Board members clustered in serious practical conversations. Jeffrey reviewed next-day press language with Grace in a low voice near the stage. The string quartet had packed up. Heels. Waiters collected untouched desserts from the Bennett table, and Lena found herself staring at that empty platform longer than she meant to. It was strange what hurt after the adrenaline receded. Not Richard's affair. She had mourned that months ago. Heels. Not Patricia's contempt. That had become background weather. What hurt was seeing the chair that should have been hers, and realizing how long she had cooperated with the lie that she did not belong in places she had built. Grace touched her arm. Heels. Cars ready. The drive to the penthouse was quiet. Heels. Only when the tower disappeared behind them did Lena let her face fall. She was not triumphant. She was exhausted, hollowed out in the way that people often are after they finally stop carrying something heavy. Grace did not fill the silence. She knew better. Heels. In the elevator up to the penthouse, Lena caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. The red dress, the carefully arranged hair, the makeup still intact, the eyes older than they had been that morning. Did I go too far? She asked. Heels. Grace considered that seriously. No, she said. You finally went far enough. Inside the penthouse, the city spread out below them in clean lines of light. Lena kicked off her heels and stood barefoot on the hardwood. Heels. Feeling the strange intimacy of a home no one had yet used against her. Grace made tea. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, both suddenly aware that now the machinery would begin. Lawyers. Statements. Speculation. Attempted spin. Heels. He'll come for the narrative first, Grace said. Heels. Not the money? Both, Grace answered. But ego fights story before it fights math. She was right. At 9:47 the next morning, Richard was served. At 9:48 he called. Lena let it ring twice before answering. Not to be kind. To be deliberate. Heels. Her CFO paused the quarterly review and quietly left her office. Richard did not say hello. You can't do this. This is fraud. No, it isn't. You lied about your entire life. I withheld information. Poorly. Harmfully. Heels. I've already owned that. You set me up. Lena leaned back in her chair and looked through the glass wall of her office at employees moving through Morrison Tower, carrying coffee, laptops, decisions, ordinary responsibilities. Feels. Life never pauses cleanly for personal collapse. Richard, I gave you years to know me better. You never asked the right questions. Don't you dare turn this around. I'm not turning anything. I'm naming it. There's a difference. He exhaled sharply. Feels. My lawyers say you can't just cut me out. Your lawyers can say whatever they're billing you to say. I was your husband, Lena said. You were. It is amazing how grammar can clarify emotional truth. Past tense often lands harder than accusation. Feels. So that's it? He demanded. 5 years and I get paperwork. Lena nearly laughed, not from cruelty, but from astonishment at how completely he still centered his own injury. 5 years and I got infidelity, disrespect, and erasure. Feels. Paperwork is actually one of the more civil endings available here. He went quiet. For a second, she thought perhaps reality had finally pierced him. Then he asked the question she should have expected all along. How much are you worth? Feels. Lena closed her eyes, not because the question hurt, because it completed the lesson. Enough to never answer that to you again, she said, and ended the call. Harold later approved of that response more than he should have. Professionally unwise. Feels, he said. Feels. Spiritually satisfying. The press cycle exploded by noon, but Grace's preparation held. The framing remained anchored to Lena's emergence as CEO, her foundation announcement, her leadership record, Feels, and the broader conversation about women in power, public privacy, and relationship dynamics under class distortion. Business outlets wrote about strategy and succession transparency, Feels. A few softer magazines tried to make it all about the glamorous betrayal, but the company's substance was too strong for gossip to dominate. More importantly, women began writing to Morrison Holdings in absurd numbers. Not formal letters, emails, Feels, direct messages, notes passed through publicists, a surgeon in Chicago who said she had hidden emotion from a boyfriend for months because he resented her success, Feels. A teacher in Atlanta who stayed quiet through repeated disrespect because everyone told her she was lucky to be chosen, Feels. A nonprofit founder in London who thanked Lena for saying, "Please don't make yourself smaller to be easier to love." The line circulated far beyond finance circles, Feels. Grace started collecting the messages in a private folder titled Reasons This Mattered. On the third day, Lena read through them alone and cried again, not because she wanted admiration, Feels, because pain becomes more bearable when it is transformed into usefulness. That is one of the few alchemies available to adults. Not every wound becomes wisdom, but some do if you refuse to weaponize them against yourself, Feels. The legal process was ugly in exactly the ways Harold predicted. Richard's team floated the argument that she had deceived him into marriage under false pretenses. They hinted at emotional manipulation, Feels. They suggested he had provided reputational and social support. Harold demolished most of it with documentation, timelines, and the simple problem of evidence, Feels. Richard had contributed no strategic value to Morrison Holdings because he had not even known he was adjacent to it. He had not provided material support because the material structure had flowed the opposite direction, Feels. He had not maintained fidelity or respect. Courts, like boardrooms, care about records. Still, the process took a toll. Some nights Lena came home unable to speak, Feels. Some mornings she sat in her car, outside the tower, for 10 minutes longer than necessary, breathing through a resistance that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with starting over while the world watched. Healing remained uneven, Feels. She kept going to therapy. She kept reading her father's notes. She learned to eat dinner alone without turning on television for company. She relearned pleasure in small forms. Flowers on the kitchen counter, long baths, music in the apartment, Feels, answering to no one. Loneliness visited, yes, but it no longer had humiliation living inside it. That made all the difference, Feels. James called her once, 6 weeks after the gala. She almost didn't answer. "I'm not calling on Patricia's behalf," he said immediately. "Or Richard's. Why are you calling?" There was a long pause. "To apologize for what I allowed." She sat down slowly, Feels. "You weren't my husband." "No," he said, "but I was old enough to know better." He did not ask for absolution. That made the apology meaningful. He spoke about patterns, Feels. About how families train themselves to treat one person as the adjustment point because that person is graceful enough to absorb it. "You were always expected to be the flexible one," he said. "That was convenient for all of us." "Yes," Lena replied, Feels. "It was." He wished her well. He said Richard was angrier than ashamed, but that perhaps shame would arrive later when anger tired itself out. Maybe, Lena said. She did not need that maybe to become true. Feels. One of the quiet gifts of recovery is learning not to require another person's growth before allowing your own peace. Feels. Candace never called. That too was fine. She disappeared from society pages within a month. Patricia tried, through mutual acquaintances, to suggest reconciliation would have been more elegant than divorce. Elegance, Lena realized, feels, is often the word people use when they mean silence in service of hierarchy. She declined every message. Morrison Holdings moved forward. The foundation launched. Feels. The Urban Development Division secured its first public-private partnership in a mid-sized city that had spent years underinvesting in both housing and green infrastructure. At the press event, Feels. A young reporter asked Lena whether the experience with her marriage had changed her leadership style. It was an irritating question in theory, but she answered it honestly. It changed my tolerance for ambiguity where respect is concerned, Feels, she said. In business and in personal life, people deserve clarity. If something is broken, say it. If someone is carrying too much quietly, notice it, Feels. If a system only works because one person keeps making themselves smaller, that system is not healthy. It's just familiar. That quote traveled almost as widely as the first one. It ended up on wellness pages and leadership blogs, and annoyingly, Feels, several overpriced mugs. Lena still found the public appetite for simplified inspiration vaguely embarrassing. But if simplification was the price of getting a useful idea into more rooms, she could live with it. Months later, on an ordinary evening, Feels, she stood by the window in her penthouse with a cup of tea and looked down at the city where she had once believed she had to choose between love and truth. She no longer believed that. The healthier lesson was harder and better, Feels. Love without truth is performance. Truth without respect is brutality. A decent life requires both. She had not become cynical. That was another small miracle. She still believed in partnership. She still believed people could grow. Feels. She still believed tenderness mattered. But now she understood that tenderness without boundaries becomes self-betrayal, and boundaries without compassion become armor too heavy to live in. She wanted neither extreme. She wanted wholeness. Feels. One night, Grace asked her, over takeout and spreadsheets on the dining table, whether she would ever tell this story in full. I already did. Grace shook her head. No, I mean the human part. Lena looked around the apartment. The books, Feels. The quiet, the city, the life reassembled one honest choice at a time. Maybe someday, she said. But if I do, I don't want it told like a revenge story. How do you want it told? Grace asked. Lena thought for a moment. Feels. Like a cautionary tale about shrinking, and a hopeful one about stopping. That is the truest ending available here. Not that the villain was ruined and the heroine rose in perfect glory. Life is rarely that neat. Feels. The truer ending is that a woman who had almost disappeared inside a polished marriage chose, finally, to return to herself. She told the truth. She accepted her part in the damage without excusing anyone else's. She left. She built better. Feels. She added value to the wound by turning it into language other people could use to save themselves time, dignity, and years. And somewhere in that city, people who heard about the red dress, the back table, the shattered champagne glass, Feels. And the woman on the stage understood something they had not understood before. Respect is not a bonus feature in love. It is the structure. Without it, all the chandeliers in the world are just expensive light falling on a very lonely room.